The Canadian Senate is scared of a new law that's set to pass in the next couple of weeks. Now, they've taken a hard look at this bill and they've determined that, well, there's a chance that this could give the government the power to regulate the content that people post on social media platforms by determining what content gets shown to Canadians prominently and which ones conveniently go to the bottom of the social media feed. I'm talking, of course, about Bill C-11, the bill that would make these changes to the law such that this kind of regulation could be possible. Now, if you're not familiar with C-11, don't worry, we're going to get you fully up to speed and talk about what's been going on recently with this. And before we do, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Now, the stated intent of this bill is to even the playing field for Canadian media in the age of digital streaming, forcing big streaming companies like Netflix or maybe Amazon Prime Video to pay for and promote more heavily Canadian-focused content. While this bill was being studied both by the House of Commons and the Senate, well, a lot of experts came forward and said, hey, while this might be the intent of the bill to force these big streaming services to pay more for Canadian content, well, actually there are some loopholes in this bill that could allow the CRTC and by extension the government to regulate user-generated content. Now, what is user-generated content or UGC? Well, that could look like content such as the YouTube video you're watching right now that I've posted on YouTube, or even media that you personally post on Twitter or Facebook. Now, obviously, a lot of people are worried about this, including the Canadian Senate, right? Because if this is true, the CRTC could, in theory, regulate what's seen most prominently by Canadians on their social media feeds, which, again, obviously is a huge and extreme power, and because it's able to sway the hearts and minds of Canadian citizens. Just look at the impact that social media has had on elections in other countries. So as a result of these concerns, the Canadian Senate said, okay, well, we will pass your bill, but we're only going to pass it if you make certain changes in it to make it clear that the bill clearly states that this only applies to big streaming companies and won't apply to user-generated content. But for some reason, after these changes were proposed by the Senate, the government came back and said, no, actually, we're not going to listen to you and we're not going to make these changes. We're going to leave the bill as is. Now, again, obviously, people were pretty pissed and worried about this.
If this bill does not affect what Canadians will post, why did this government choose to remove the amendment that would have explicitly said that? We've been accused repeatedly throughout the debate, the Conservative members of they say, misinformation, and yet they had refused to explicitly exclude content posted by Canadians. Why?
Member for Hamilton Mountain.
Thank you, Speaker. The only amendments this government did not accept were amendments that created loopholes that would have allowed streaming companies to get out of their obligations. This is all about supporting Canadian culture and Canadian artists.
So they're saying that the reason they don't want to include these recommended changes from the Senate is because it would make loopholes that these big streaming companies could then jump through to avoid the entire point of the regulation, which in the government's eyes is to make sure that they pay for and promote Canadian-focused content. Now, to that I say, okay, fair. If you're drafting this legislation, you want the intent of the bill to actually apply. You don't want people to be able to jump through these loopholes, right, so that they can skirt the rules and not pay their fair share. But then why wouldn't you just change the wording of the bill yourself to make that clear? Make it clear that this is only applying to these big streaming platforms. And if you don't like the language that the Senate used and you think that there's loopholes in there, then just make new language yourself so it applies only to those big companies and not to individual Canadians posting user-generated content. I don't get why they wouldn't make this change. But it turns out when you look at the reason that they've sort of rejected this change to the bill, well, you find out that it actually wasn't about loopholes to begin with. It was actually about making sure that they could regulate content in the future.
The rationale behind the rejection for content creators is finally said the quiet part out loud. It's right here. For the government that claims that user-generated content was never going to be part of this bill or won't be part of this bill, they took out that amendment and then they rejected the fact that the amendment would have been put back in the bill. It says the opposite right in the rationale. The government wants the power to direct the CRTC on user content today, and they want the power to do it in the future. Regulatory power over user content is confirmed in that explanation. It covers YouTube videos, podcasts, and any other content on platforms we don't even know exists yet, because that's what adapting to technological changes means. They've regulated something that doesn't even exist yet.
Now, anyone who's speaking up about this bill is sort of being labeled as someone who's standing up for the interests of big billionaire corporations and saying, okay, you don't want them to pay their fair share then, that's why you're pushing against this bill, when really that isn't the reality. People are just rightfully concerned about user-generated content being regulated. Obviously, this is a huge power that an unelected board of people called the CRTC shouldn't have the ability to regulate. Now, amidst all of these concerns, the Minister for Heritage, the Member of Parliament who actually tabled this bill, was responsible for getting it through the House of Commons, tweeted this out, sort of explaining in his eyes what this bill and this new law will do and what it won't do, with a very sort of brief bullet point version of it, saying C11 will have the platforms pay their fair share, support the next generation of Canadian artists, create good jobs for Canadians, lift up Indigenous and diverse voices, and result in more options for Canadians to watch. And he pushes back against claims that say that C11, or he's saying that C11 will not tell Canadians what to watch, infringe on free speech, regulate users or creators on social media platforms, that's referring to the user-generated content, create censorship on the internet, and any other ridiculous thing that the Conservatives come up with to scare Canadians. Now, I think a post like this is actually rather dangerous. First of all, just saying that this is just a ridiculous proposal from the Conservatives, saying that they're just trying to scare Canadians. Well, this, of course, isn't the case, because it was the bipartisan Senate, Liberals, NDPs, Conservatives, all appointed by different members of Parliament and different prime ministers. Well, it was them who came up with these amendments because they were worried about the bill. So sort of saying here that it's the Conservatives that are sort of only the ones voicing these concerns and they're just doing it to make the government look bad and to make Canadians scared is a little bit of a moot point. And I think in general, it's dangerous to make posts like this on social media talking about what a new law does and what a new law doesn't do, right? It's like getting someone to sign a big contract and telling them, well, if this big contract is too long and too complex to read for yourself, well, just read these bullet points that I've drafted for you to summarize what I think is the most important content that's inside of this big, long contract, right? Obviously, there could be more in that big document, but why should you trust someone who's trying to get you to sign the contract to be the one that accurately summarizes the content of the contract for you, right? Obviously, there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there. So what happens now? I mean, the Senate said, okay, we want to make changes to this bill. We think that there are some concerning things in here and we want you to make edits to it. To that, the government replied, no, we're not going to listen to you. What happens now? Does the bill just get passed, or does the Senate have more say? And I was curious about this, so I looked it up. Now, usually when bills pass into the Senate usually agrees with them and sends them back without amendment. And in the cases where they do provide sort of slight amendments, usually the government will accept them, right? So I've never actually seen this before, but I found this from the government website that says what happens here. If the House does not agree with Senate amendments, it adopts a motion stating the reasons for its disagreement, which it communicates in a message to the Senate. That message has already been sent to the Senate. If the Senate wishes the amendments to stand nonetheless, it sends a message back to the House, which then accepts or rejects the proposed changes. If an agreement cannot be reached by exchanged messaging, then the House that has possession of the bill may ask that a conference be held between the two houses, but that doesn't really happen that much. The practice has fallen out of disuse. So essentially we have a stalemate here where they're going to go back and forth with messages, and maybe the Senate will just say, oh, well, whatever, just pass the bill as is, even if you're not going to take our concerns seriously. I hope that doesn't happen, and I hope they put up a little bit more of a fight, but we really don't know at this point what's going to happen. Now, at the end of the day, do I think that the government and the CRTC would immediately start regulating user-generated content and sort of censoring and changing what Canadians see on their social media feeds? To that, I say no. That's not something that I expect, and it's not something I think is likely to happen. But the fact that the language inside of the bill exists that could allow for this to happen means that we don't just have to worry about what would happen today. We have to worry about what would happen over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years after this bill is made into law, right? Even if I don't think that a current government would actively go in and censor, who knows what government could be in power 30, 40, 50 years down the line that this bill could be applied for, right? If there's a loophole in here that gives too much power to regulatory bodies, then we don't just need to worry about today, we need to worry about the entirety of the future as well. And this is the same sort of argument that I had when we were talking about the Emergencies Act and the invocation of that during the protests, right? Like, do I think that this was a gross misuse of power that was immediately trying to sort of take away freedoms from Canadians? No, I don't think that this instance was, but it sets the precedent that just for a protest, these sweeping powers of the Emergency Act could be invoked in the future by another government that maybe you agree with less, right? Like, this is the concern, is that setting precedent and changing laws like this, you don't just have to worry about the implications of right now, you gotta worry about the future as well, at least in my eyes. Am I off base here, or does this make sense? I'm curious what you think about all of this. Let me know down in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I'm gonna keep you posted as to what happens with this story and a whole host of other Canadian issues. So if you're not already subscribed, I appreciate you clicking that button. It helps out the channel. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching this video. I really hope it helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.